Some experiences of a pioneer doctor in the North. I practiced medicine in the Alberta part of the Peace River country from June 1921 to June 57. I saw this new country grow up. I'm no public speaker. As a whale once said to her calf, "Remember, son, it's only when you're spouting that you're allowed to be harpooned." So I've never done much spouting in public. This will only be a chat. First, I'd like to give you a brief resume of my background. I was born in Peterborough, Ontario in March 1896 into a family of 7, 5 boys and 2 girls. I was the second youngest. I got my senior matriculation there, started medicine in Toronto in September 1913, joined the 2nd Division of the Canadian Army in March 1915 as a stretcher bearer, spent 3.5 years overseas, almost 3 years of that time at the front in France. In September 1918, I was sent home along with some other medical and dental students to finish our courses. We got home October the 10th and started medicine again in Toronto in uniform. But on November the 13th, we were discharged and out on our own. Our father had died while 3 of us boys were in France, but my oldest brother, a doctor in Winnipeg, helped me financially till I graduated in May 1921. At that time, I had been asked to go to Ocean Falls, BC, to assist a doctor there, so I took my Dominion Council examination so I could practice in the West. I had just finished these exams when I got an urgent telegram from my brother-in-law, Jack Archer, a lawyer in the Peace River country, to come at once to Lake Saskatoon, a small village there north of the 55th parallel. The only doctor there had left because his young wife had died. So not knowing whether I had passed my Dominion Council exams or not, I left by train for Edmonton, and I'm glad I did. I found out in Edmonton that I had passed. I got registered with the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and in a few days I left by the weekly train for Grand Prairie, then the end of Steele. A 500-mile trip that took 30 hours. If it got there. Grand Prairie is 260 miles northwest of Edmonton as the crow flies. And Lake Saskatoon was 15 miles northwest of there. Mr. Archie met me at the station and drove me to Lake Saskatoon, where some calls were already waiting. I had only $10 in my name when I arrived there, and there were so many things I needed. My oldest brother, the doctor, had bought me a medical bag and some necessary instruments when I stopped in Winnipeg. My second oldest brother, Dave, had been wounded severely just after we took Demi Ridge, and had taken up Soldier Settlement Board land on the east shore of Lake Saskatoon. The village was on the west shore. As one great need was a car, Dave mortgaged his farm and lent me enough money to buy a brand new 1921 T-model Ford. That was the first year that Henry Ford had put a self-starter on them, and was a most useful addition both in winter and summer. I found this a beautiful rolling country, so different from the prairies, dotted with lakes and bluffs of trees, high and sunny skies, and wild ducks and geese flying high in the fall, and always the snow-capped Rocky Mountains on the horizon. It looked like the promised land to me. There were many men there who had just returned from the First World War, on the farms and in the towns, and some with English brides. Lake Saskatoon had been the distributing center for the whole area till the railroad came in 1916, making Grand Prairie the end of Steele. The big trading companies then moved away, the Hudson Bay, Revian Freres, the Diamond P, etc. So I rented the Diamond P store, mostly because it had a nice new lean-to that had been built on its west side. It made a good warm office, and I slept in the big unheated store those first 2 winters. There were usually a few 5-foot-high blocks of ice about my bed, as that was my water supply. A Scotch lady made me 2 big comforters, each lined with carded wool about an inch thick, so I slept comfortably. For this luxurious accommodation I paid $5 a month, but after paying my large livery bill and my drug bill, it wasn't always easy to find that $5. I had to carry my own medicines. I couldn't just give a prescription to patients living 30 or more miles from a drugstore. There was no antifreeze for cars in those days, and winter set in early. At first I used coal oil in my radiator, but the motor would get so cold the car wouldn't start. So then I used just water, a tricky business at 20 to 30 degrees below zero. even with a good radiator cover, a large piece of cardboard, and a thermometer visibly sticking out of the radiator cap. I used to keep 2 large pails of water boiling on my office stove. So when I had to start the car in cold weather, I'd pour 1 pailful into the radiator with a big funnel, leaving the drainage tap open, and then shut the tap and pour in the 2nd pailful. When the engine had warmed a bit in 4 or 5 minutes, I'd turn it over a few times with the crank, pour a kettle of boiling water on the carburetor, get in, pull out the choke, step on the starter, and it usually started. If not, I cranked it. Then if the tires were not frozen to the ground or flat, I'd get away. So often the very cold weather would make those early tires go flat. But in the winter I usually drove a cutter and team, and in the spring and fall a buggy and team, on the clay roads and prairie trails. But these roads were like pavement when dry in the summer. But that was the shortest season of the year there. When asked what we did there in the summertime, one fellow said, oh, we play baseball that day. But the season for hockey and curling was much longer. I met an old army friend a few years ago who said I was looking young. When I told him I'd lived up in the Peace River country for 36 years, he said, oh, that explains it. Anything will keep in a deep freeze, even the province is called sunny Alberta. The days in June and July are quite long. When you have to look south to see the brilliant northern lights, you begin to realize you're up in the north. In June and July, one can read or play golf till 10:30 p.m., and the north glows all night like the midnight sun. But in December and January, the days are real short. Lights are needed in the buildings before 4 p.m., and it's cold. I have driven by a government thermometer at midnight that registers 65 degrees below zero at the experimental farm at Beaver Lodge. But every January or February, we often got 1 or 2 Chinooks. We welcomed that warm, dry wind from the Pacific coming at us over the mountains. We have seen the temperature change 90 degrees in an hour or two, from 40 below zero to 50 above. The snows would start melting and the ditches start running, and you'd think spring had come for sure. But in 2 or 3 days, the temperature would drop to way below zero again. This was hard on gardens and trees. As a warning of a Chinook, a blue-green haze would be seen in the west, called a Chinook arch. Soon you can hear a rushing sound, and then the warm wind hits you. People would come out of hibernation, and so would some animals. The Chinooks are a wonderful phenomena, and they sure break the monotony of winter there. In 1928, I was lucky enough to get a great fur coat. It had been ordered by the Russian ambassador in England, but by the time they had it made for him, diplomatic relations had been cut off with Russia. A man who worked at the furriers in London sent it to his brother, a farmer south of Lake Saskatoon, and I got it from him by a trade and some cash. It was reindeer calf on the outside and wombat skin on the inside, with a thick woolen lining between and a high beaver collar. It was huge, and had been made for a much bigger man than I am. I had to get 6 or 8 inches cut off the bottom before I could walk in it. I already had a coonskin coat, and this new one slipped over the top of the coon one nicely. I had large beaver gauntlets and a fur hat. The Grand Prairie paper had an entry in it one day under a column called Things I Have Seen, saying, Dr. Carlisle with enough fur on for an Arctic expedition. But it sure kept me warm. When I would start out on a cold trip with a cutter and team, dressed conservatively in heavy Stanfield underwear, with all this fur on, which is like a mattress, with a charcoal heat warmer burning at my feet under a big buffalo robe, the weather didn't seem too bad. Eventually the reindeer calf fur on the outside started to wear off, and it was christened by our family the Count of Asthma. The worst time for getting around in the car was in the spring. The snow on the roads would melt all day in the warm spring sun, forming pools, which would freeze over each night, just mining the roads like tank traps for cars. I was coming home from Grand Prairie about 4:30 one April morning when I broke through the ice in one of these tank traps. There was just one thing to do, get a team to pull the car out, so I walked 1/3 of a mile west and 1/3 of a mile north to the farmhouse of an Irishman I knew, Mike Cochran. I threw some snowballs and pebbles at his upper window to waken him, helped him hitch his team, and we walked down to the car in the spring dawn, dragging a chain. On the way down, he said, "Have you got your tooth forceps with you, Doc?" And I said, "Oh, yes, Mike, I always carry them." So he hitched the chain to the Ford, and we splashed through the water, ice, and mud to firm ground. Then he pointed to a lower molar. So I said, "Oh, yes, Mike, sit down." So he sat down on the wide running board of the Ford, and I pulled out his aching tooth. As he sat there afterwards, spitting blood on the snow, he said, "Well, what do I owe you, Doc?" And I said, "Well, what do I owe you, Mike?" "Well, I guess one good pull deserves another." And I said, "That's very generous of you, Mike, but when I went to help him up, his trousers were frozen solidly to the running board." He said, "You're a heck of a dentist. You don't freeze me up here, but down there." Dentists were scarce in Canada in 1921 when I graduated, so the university during our 5th year gave medical students some instruction on tooth extractions and local anesthesia, which was a big help to me. When we got married first, I promised to give my wife all the money I made taking out teeth, but I soon had to break that promise, as that is the only service for which I usually got cash. I had many calls to the country, and the farther out the patients were, the less money they had. So I wrote to the public health department in Edmonton, and eventually they paid me $100 a month for the next 3 years for my work in the 3 unorganized districts west of Lake Saskatoon. I was the only doctor between there and the BC border for 45 to 65 miles, and the only ambulance. On one far-out trip, the only food in the bachelor shack was eggs. So a district nurse and I had just 6 boiled eggs apiece for lunch, and a mug of tea, and we were grateful and hungry. In the summer of 1921, I first met my future wife, a student from Toronto University, home on her summer holidays. We came engaged in the following summer, and the next year, 1923, we were married. She had graduated, and I had bought and fixed up a house. And where do you think we went on our honeymoon? To Victoria, BC, and we liked it, and still do. The country was in a recession when I got there in 1921 due to a cow bill passed in 1912 to encourage farmers to buy cattle, and the banks were allowed to lend farmers money up to $500 just for cattle. But in 1920, the price of cattle went way down. The banks needed their money back, and money was tight. The banks held mortgages on all the farmers' chattels, which left the businessmen and merchants without any security. You may have heard this story. A man was seeing a bank manager when the phone rang. The manager answered and said, "No, no, oh no. Yes, no, oh no," and hung up. The man laughed and said, "I was just wondering what you said yes to." The banker said, "No, he asked me if I could hear him." And the bankers had a rough time too. The early days in this new country were the hardest for me, but the most interesting to look back on. The hungry 20s and 30s, so-called. But few, if any, ever went hungry or thirsty or cold. The settlers had not been there long enough to become established. They had no backlog, especially when the Great Depression came in the 1930s. We knew thrifty farmers who said that all they bought in the stores during that time was sugar and salt. But it was a very fertile, productive land. I have a newspaper article here that claims that the soil around that area of Lake Saskatoon, later called Wembley, has grown more world champion grains for farmers than the soil of all the rest of Canada put together. Herman Trelly, whose farm was 2 miles south of Lake Saskatoon, won the World Wheat Championship 4 times and was crowned the Wheat King of the World and barred from further competitions. In 1926, on his first exhibit, he won both the World Championship in wheat and in oats, the first time in the history of the Chicago World Fair that both championships had gone to the same exhibitor. His first and second prizes in grains at the various shows in Canada and the United States numbered more than 600. I had the honor of taking out the King's appendix and bringing their first princess into the world in their farmhouse. Several other exhibitors won world championships there too, in wheat, oats, timothy, peas. It became a yearly habit to go to Chicago. Garden crops were very good. Wild game and wild fowl were plentiful. Wild fruits, raspberries, strawberries, saskatoons, blueberries, etc., were abundant. There was lots of poplar wood and open-faced seams of coal in the banks of the Wapiti River, 5 miles south, to be had for the hauling. So although few could pay cash for a doctor, they did keep us well supplied with wood and coal, meat and fowl, milk and cream, butter and eggs, vegetables, and sometimes homemade coffee. They roasted a mixture of grains and ground them up. The drink tasted a little like postum. I remember one young man who brought us a load of wood saying, "Well, one more load and the baby's ours." I just stayed 3.5 years in Lake Saskatoon. Our famous railroad in 1924 was extended 15 miles west to a point 3.5 miles south of Lake Saskatoon. And eventually the whole town moved down to the railroad, which became a new town they called Wembley. The buildings were dragged or skidded down on logs in the wintertime. But I had been accepted as an intern for a year in surgery at the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto by Dr. William E. Galley, who became the professor of surgery at Toronto University and later was in charge of all the Shriners hospitals on the North American continent. It was a highly sought-after internship. I was very fortunate. Interns got no salaries in those days, just their room and board, uniforms and laundry. I was there all of 1925. It was strenuous work, but a great opportunity. I stayed on 3 months more in 1926 in pediatrics with Dr. Alan Brown, the famous pediatrician. Then we looked over Ontario for an opening, but encouraged by a warm invitation from the new town of Wembley, we returned west again in April 1926. I knew that as a place where I was needed the most and where we both had relatives and good friends. We had sold everything before going east except our house in Piana. We had had our house moved down to Wembley in the wintertime, but the snow must have obscured the landmarks, for it is placed crookedly on our lot, and is still crooked to this day. Wembley was our home for the next 10 years. Our 3 children were born there. The only hospital was in Grand Prairie, and I made that 15-mile trip each way nearly every day, and often 2 or 3 times a day, and eventually we lived in Grand Prairie for 21 years. After my 15 months at the Sick Children's Hospital, I felt much better equipped, but I still had a lot to learn. For instance, I started holding baby clinics, and at the first one I gave a prize for the best baby. Oh, that was a mistake. I never did that again. Mothers, grandmothers, and even grandfathers were mad at me for that. But the clinics were valuable. Many of the young mothers did not know how to feed their babies properly. There was no literature available to instruct them. I found many babies with rickets, and I had one baby die of it. Rickets, is caused by the lack of the fat-soluble vitamins, especially D vitamins. Boiling the milk kills the vitamins, and they were not being replaced by cod liver oil or other vitamin products or exposure to sunshine. I got literature from the Children's Hospital and gave it out freely, and for years I gave to every mother, after her first child was born, a new copy of Dr. Alan Brown's book, The Normal Child, and most of them followed it explicitly. When doctors examined the youth from that part of the Peace River country for the Army in 1939, they reported that they found the least disqualifying disabilities in them than in men from any other part of the province. I gave Dr. Alan Brown's book a lot of the credit. Our famous railroad was called the Edmonton, Dunvegan and British Columbia, or the ED&BC, or the extremely dangerous and badly constructed railroad. There are many funny stories about it. My wife was on it once and ran off the tracks 5 times in 45 miles. It was a real tuner-filled trolley. But it was the only connection we had with the outside world for 8 years after I got there. There was no road out in any direction, no telephone connection, only telegraph, no radios or aeroplanes, just a passenger train once a week, and later twice a week. So we doctors had to cope with everything that came along, and almost everything did. Dr. O'Brien and I removed a brain tumor once, but we sure sweated on that all one night. First learning how to locate it, and then how to remove it, which we did in a day or so successfully. The government started building a road to Edmonton in 1928 and finished it in 1929, but it was called the Sunshine Trail, and for a good reason. If there was no sunshine, there was no trail. Once in the 30s, my wife and I left Edmonton on a sunny Sunday morning with our city clothes on and ran into a rain shower. When it had stopped, we made only 6 miles in 4 hours. We had to go out every 300 or 400 yards and with our bare hands claw the gumbo out from under our mud guards to free the wheels. Oh, I guess some of you know what that's like. We barely made shelter for the night. In 1928, the Canadian Medical Association of all Canada was meeting in Edmonton, and I wanted to be there. The road was just being built, but my wife and her brother and I went on it anyway. We made it in 21 3/4 driving hours, beating a previous record of 27 driving hours, so the Edmonton Journal told us. The men working on the road would say, take a run at it, we'll pull you, which they did many times, often for a mile or so. The next issue of the Toronto Star Weekly had an article and a big cartoon of us saying, Doctor drives 555 miles to attend a medical convention. We'd started out at a fairly new Durant, but it wasn't quite so new when we got back. Let us run the railroad track once for a way, but it wasn't used very much anyway. There wasn't very little danger of being run over. Soon bush pilots started coming up north, performing at fairs, etc. Some took supplies up farther north to Fort McMurray and Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. And soon we got a field for them to land on. Grant McConaughey, later president of CPA, came up from Edmonton twice in a 3-engine Ford boxcar, so-called, a cargo plane, and flew me about 60 miles or so north, 2 years apart, to Treaty's mother-in-law. We landed on the back field of their farm. On one Mercy flight I was on, 50 miles east, we crashed. A woman had been kicked by a horse, which split one of her kidneys, and she was bleeding a lot. The roads were absolutely impassable, and the ferry was out. I flew out with a young pilot to the boat, and we landed on a plowed field. We got the patient bound up and loaded on our little plane. She was a big woman, weighing over 200 pounds. A patch of straight road had been cleared by the local folk, who pushed the plane out of the muddy field onto the narrow 20-foot road, and we took off. We just got a few feet off the ground when our right wing dipped a bit, and we hit one fence post after another, each nearly tearing a big rip in the canvas of the wing. But we landed back on the road with nobody hurt. The patient was taken into the house, and the pilot and I spent the rest of the evening and the night standing on boxes, sewing the rips in the canvas wing, with our hands way above our heads by lantern light. It was very painful work, and our arms ached badly, and there was a chilly breeze blowing. Besides, we were in a hurry. I had brought 2 rolls of 6-inch adhesive tape, and we wound these around the wing over the stitching to reinforce it. By the time we finished it, it was daylight. We got the plane pushed out on the road again, and the patient back in it. This time we made it. Got to the hospital in time to give the lady blood and operate. She made a good recovery. This incident was written up in the papers at the time and resurrected again 2 years ago by the Calgary Herald. I have a copy here of the article in the Calgary Herald in 1967. For several years after I returned from Toronto, I was the only doctor there who could blood group people and give transfusions. I used the continuous syringe method of whole blood. The first several years, we had to make our own serum to blood group with. Dr. L.J. O'Brien, a man in his late 50s, a skilled surgeon and a great friend of mine, was in Group 2, and I was in Group 3 by the Yansky system. So when a transfusion was needed, I would draw a syringeful of blood from him, and he would draw a syringeful from me, and when the blood settled, I had enough number 2 and number 3 serum to group the patient and 100 or more people till we found a suitable donor. We never had any serious reactions, though we gave many transfusions. One afternoon, a big income tax inspector from Edmonton, and Mr. Thompson, was waiting in my office to see me. I was blood grouping people to find the right donor for a patient and driving 4 or 5 people to the hospital every half hour. He got restless waiting, so on one trip I asked him to come along too. He came. He had the right blood group, and I had him donate a good quart of blood. But for years he used to tell his friends in Edmonton, "Oh, it's an awful country up there. I went up there once as an income tax inspector, and they bled me." In 1927, we had a large epidemic of very virulent smallpox. There were 35 deaths from it in the area from Grand Prairie to the border. The young wife of our provincial police sergeant, Sergeant Prairie, was one of the first. My wife and I went to all the schools from Wembley to the border and vaccinated all the children. The government paid nothing for this, just supplied the vaccine. My $100 a month had stopped when we went east. The teachers had asked the children to bring 50 cents apiece for their vaccination. Some did, some didn't. Some just brought the rest of their families, but all were vaccinated. The Indians had the least resistance to smallpox, almost none at all. There were a lot of Indians on the reservation at Rio Grande, 30 or more miles west of Wembley, that I looked after. A big Indian agent, Leo Ferguson, half French and half Indian, a good friend of mine, always came with me. To protect the Indians, we went first thing out to the reservation. Leo sent 9 or 10 horseback riders out in all directions and gathered the tribe together, and all the Indians were vaccinated, except 2 families and 2 teenage boys. They had hid under a little bridge or culvert and were not vaccinated. They all got black smallpox, and they all died, all 16 of them. I've often thought that the whole reservation might have been wiped out if we'd not gone out there early. Black smallpox is hemorrhagic smallpox, showing no resistance. The pox filled with blood. The patients bleed from all orifices of their body, and was always fatal in those days. Saskatoon berries were plentiful in the fall. As you know, they are like big blueberries with large seeds. They are eaten freely and preserved but are a health hazard, especially to young bachelors on their homesteads. The Indians pick them on horseback, dry them out in the sun on hides, and eat them all winter. The large seeds tend to gather in the appendices, causing abdominal pains and cramps. So often they would then take a good dose of castor oil or other strong laxative, causing the appendix to rupture. Then they would call or see a doctor, and too often it is too late. We had no sulfas, penicillin, or antibiotics at that time. We would operate with a minimum of surgery and drain, but the death rate was high. So we really had to preach the gospel not to take a strong laxative when they got a pain in their stomach. People still have a terror of appendicitis in that district. House calls after midnight were never very popular in the cold weather. I would try to get all the facts to be sure a cold trip was necessary, but they generally managed to get you out one way or another. One cold night in the 50s, a man phoned about 2 a.m. and said, "Come on down to the house, Doc. I think my wife has appendicitis." I said, appendicitis. "Why, Jack, I remember taking out your wife's appendix about 15 or 16 years ago. I never heard of anyone having 2 appendices." "Well," he said, "did you ever hear of a guy having a second wife?" "Oh," I said, "I'll be right down. They would get you out one way or another." The settlers there, as a rule, were young, hard-working people, and most friendly. No settler was young enough to have been born up there. They'd all come from other places, everywhere. There were some older men who had come down from the Yukon and Alaska. They'd been prospectors who had gone north in the gold rush of 1898 and had great tales to tell. I treated one of them that said he had been so long in the north he had Arctic circles under both eyes. Of course, his trouble was he'd burned out his kidneys on cheap liquor and moonshine. A good writer could have written wonderful books about the characters there. When the Duke of Devonshire was the Governor-General of Canada, he came up there on a shooting trip. His itinerant took him to Henry Roberts's place for lunch one day. Henry was a good farmer on the shores of a big lake, Bear Lake, where the ducks and geese are plentiful. As the ladies were taking away the dishes from the meat course, Henry said loudly, "Keep your fork, Duke, there's pie coming," which became quite a saying in that country. An elderly Irishman, Frank White, a homesteader at Halcourt, 40 miles west of Grand Prairie, was a real character, of whom there are many stories. He made good bread for all the bachelors around and served good Sunday meals on a long, clean table in his log shack. A visiting preacher came one Sunday and sat down at the head of Frank's table, with 6 or 7 young bachelors sitting at it. Frank was at the stove when the preacher turned and said, Mr. White, do you mind if I say grace? Frank said, oh, say any darn thing you like. There's not a woman within 40 miles. There was always lots of humor around. I was a coroner there for 36 years, but a younger man did that job for the last while. But I had many interesting cases and could tell you some grim and true murder stories. I even led a posse in 1923 of 35 men through a dark woods on a May dawn in search of a murderer, a moonshiner, who had just shot and killed his partner. The police asked me to take over while they went to look for him at his house. We didn't run into him, I'm glad. He escaped our amateur net, but it was a spooky experience in the dark. He'd been in there a few hours earlier as a tree fell over quite near when I was examining the body. But I think you've heard enough for one night. When trying to describe the beauty of this new country, I found some lines from an unknown poet and changed them a bit to fit the north. Fall, Rockies on the far horizon, the infinite tender sky, the ripe rich tint of the wheat fields, and the wild ducks sailing high, and over the lakes and the uplands a honking wild goose squad. Some folks called it autumn, and others called it God. Well, take a rest. 'Twas a long-winded speech, but they seemed to enjoy it, and I thought you'd like to hear it.